Newcomers Town. A quiet village in central Ohio is a welcoming town home to thousands of families all looking to live life to the best that they can. For many, it's a beautiful place to raise a family, but for at least one couple, their happy little village is simultaneously home to their greatest memories and their most tragic experience, the disappearance of their 19-year-old daughter. Susan Diane Wolff Cappel was going through a difficult patch. She had separated from her husband and was in the midst of a frustrating child custody case. Trying to put the pieces back together, she moved home with her parents, picked up 2 jobs, and began setting the foundation for her future and that of her 15-month-old son. Then, on a cool and rainy Tuesday night, as she finished up a shift at one of her jobs, a blue car pulled up beside her, driven by an unidentified man. Moments later, the young mother climbed into the car and has never been seen again. While investigators theorize that Susan may have planned to run away, more than 4 decades later, the vast majority believe she was the victim of foul play. Rumors abound about who might have been responsible, but the most important question that remains is one her family desperately hopes to find. Where is Susan? This is Trace Evidence, episode 221, The Disappearance of Susan Wolff Cappel. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the mysterious 1982 disappearance of Susan Wolff Cappel. Before getting into the case, just a few quick notes about the show. Trace Evidence is a weekly true crime podcast focused on unsolved murders and disappearances. Visit trace-evidence.com for all social media links, episode breakdowns, donation options, and contact information. You can submit case suggestions through the website or by emailing me directly at traceevidencepod@gmail.com. As a final note, this year, CrimeCon will be taking place in Orlando, Florida from September 22nd through the 24th. I'll be there representing Trace Evidence on Podcast Row, and I hope to see you too. Visit crimecon.com and use promo code TRACE to save 10% on your pass. That's crimecon.com, promo code TRACE. 19-year-old Susan Cappel walked out of work, got into a car with someone, and vanished. More than 40 years later, and the mystery of her fate has never been uncovered. This is episode 221, The Disappearance of Susan Wolff Cappel. It was a chilly Tuesday night in Newcomers Town, Ohio, when 19-year-old Susan Wolff Cappel drove over to the local grocery store where she was employed part-time. In the midst of a divorce and fighting for custody of her son, she was upbeat and excited that night as she'd just gotten good news. A hearing had finally been set for custody, and she couldn't wait to get her beloved baby boy back into her arms. Ending her shift at 9 p.m., the young mother made her way across the parking lot, which glistened beneath the vapor lights following some light rains which had returned on and off that evening. Carrying her blue windbreaker, Susan made her way towards her parents' car, which she'd been using since her separation. She was excited to get home so she could finish a project she'd been working on for her and her son. But before she could make it to the door, an older model blue car pulled up beside her. Susan exchanged a few words with the driver and flashed a look of frustration to a coworker before walking around the vehicle and climbing inside. The car slowly rolled out of the parking lot, and Susan was never seen alive again. Back at her family's home on Wood Avenue, just a mile away, the back porch light burned brightly so the 19-year-old wouldn't stumble on her way in. However, Susan never made it back to the home, and for more than 4 decades, the light continues to glow in the darkness, hoping to someday be the light that guides her home. Susan Diane Wolff was born on Friday, March 30th, 1962 in Coshocton, Ohio, to parents Judith and James. Susan would be the Wolffs' first and only daughter, growing up with 3 brothers. Susan, or Sue as most people called her, would grow up in the central Ohio village of Newcomers Town, 85 miles northeast of Columbus and set in the southwestern corner of Tuscarawas County. Newcomers Town, named after a Native American chief of the Lenape, has ebbed and flowed over the years, with its population shrinking some decades and growing in others. During the 1960s, when Susan was a child, the population was steadily declining, and over the next 20 years, the village would see more of a drop of nearly 15%. According to friends and family, Sue was a polite, kind, funny, loving, and creative child. As a youngster, she enjoyed playing outside, exploring, and creating art. Several pieces she crafted over the years, including a string art sailing ship and an intricate picture of butterflies woven in string, is still in the family home. Susan grew up in a tight-knit, loving family, and her parents were very much involved in their children's lives. A key facet of the Wolff home revolved around their faith. As devoted Lutherans, the Wolffs raised their children through the church, St. Paul's, and Susan would go on to become a member and was also involved in the youth ministry. Sue went on to attend Newcomers Town High School, where she performed extremely well, both in classes and with extracurricular activities. Sue, an honors student, focused her studies in on business office education. She hoped after graduation to pick up work in a nice office environment. Outside of her studies, Sue was also very involved in the band. She had been a member of the band for 5 years, though would eventually transition from playing an instrument to twirling a baton. For her last 3 years in high school, Sue developed into a highly skilled majorette, and in her senior year, she was head majorette. So exceptional was Sue's skill that she obtained a license from the United States Twirling Association, and while still attending high school, she taught baton at Bev's dance studio in Dover and was the manager of Sue's baton studio in nearby Port Washington. To say Sue was driven, skilled, and mature enough to handle the weight of instructing, working, and school all at the same time would be an understatement. Sue's senior year would be one of triumph, accomplishments, and surprise, as her life would take a turn that almost no one would have expected. Sue had been seeing a guy 2 years older than her named Alan Cappel. Through the natural course of their relationship, Sue became pregnant, and the two decided they should get married. The service took place on Saturday, February 23, 1980, at St. Paul's Lutheran Church. According to the marriage announcement, Sue was still instructing baton at the time, while Alan had previously graduated from Indian Valley South High School and was at the time employed by the Ohio Department of Transportation. At the time of the marriage, Sue was 17 and Alan was 19. 7 months later, on Tuesday, September 26, 1980, Susan gave birth to a son. This was, according to everyone who knew Susan, the highlight of her entire life. She was absolutely in love with her baby boy and was exceedingly proud to be his mother. She doted on the child, spent much of her free time with him, and did everything she could to provide him with a happy, healthy, and loving home environment. Unfortunately, according to Sue's family, the marriage had hit several rocky patches early on, and it seemed that the divide between husband and wife was growing with each day. Within just the first 8 months of their marriage, the issues had caused Sue to leave on 3 separate occasions. What those reasons were has never been fully revealed, though many have claimed that Sue was verbally abused and found their home life too difficult to tolerate. Sue's parents, Jim and Judy, would later share their belief that the issues in the marriage revolved around control. Judy, especially, felt that Alan had tried to keep Sue under his thumb while working to limit her access to her family. In later years, Alan claimed that the marriage would have survived and would have been fine if it hadn't been for Judy, who he described as Susan's meddling mother. What exactly was going on is uncertain, though it appears that disputes between the couple were growing worse over time and the dam was preparing to fracture. That would ultimately happen in January of 1982, when Sue was 19 years old. On January 3rd, Sue arrived at her parents' Wood Avenue home and explained the situation to them. Judy, having seen her daughter going through these problems previously, advised that maybe the marriage just wasn't meant to work out. It seems, unlike previous separations, this time it would stick, and Sue was committed to moving on with her life. At the time, all she had were the clothes on her back. She didn't have the financial stability to head out on her own, and while weighing the possibilities, her parents interjected, telling her that she could move back in with them until she was able to get back on her feet. She was excited by the prospect and within a few days was discussing plans to repaint her childhood bedroom so that she and her son could share it. Wanting to do the best she could for her little boy, Sue started working 2 jobs. First, she got hired on at a local supermarket, Thompson's IGA. She worked in the deli department Monday through Friday, 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. Then, on weekends, she worked in the medical records department of Timken Mercy Medical Center in Canton. She was excited about the job in Canton as the facility was in the early stages of an expansion, after the conclusion of which Sue expected to be brought on full-time. During the weekend of January 16th and 17th, Sue made plans with some friends to go out and have a little fun. After securing her son with a babysitter she trusted, the 19-year-old headed out to a local bowling alley. Details of this evening are somewhat difficult to discern. However, it appears that at some point that night, Alan either became aware of Sue being out or had some knowledge of this babysitter. While Sue was at the alley, Alan arrived at the babysitter's place and took his son back. When Sue found out, she was very upset, and according to friends and family, Alan wasn't interested in letting her see her son. Just a few days later, on Thursday, January 21st, Alan officially filed for divorce and full custody of their son. At the time, he was granted temporary custody and turned the child over to an aunt of his living in Zanesville, approximately 50 miles southwest of Newcomerstown. Deeply upset and frustrated with the situation, Sue took legal action as well, and on Wednesday, January 27th, she filed a counterclaim requesting that the court return custody of their son to her. A hearing was scheduled to take place in regard to the question of custody. However, it would get postponed 3 times, only adding to the grief and anger on both sides. For the next few weeks, it was all a waiting game as Sue was denied access to her son and the court dates continued to shift. Despite the situation she found herself in, Sue tried to remain upbeat. She added her son to the insurance she had gotten through her job in Canton and purchased a baby bed. The next part of the project would involve painting her old room, at the time a shade of orange that suggested it had been painted last when she was in high school. Tuesday, March 16th, Susan was scheduled to work her usual shift of 4 to 9 at IGA, so she planned to utilize the free part of her morning and afternoon to get some work done. Having purchased supplies and green paint, she began laying the first layer of color over the old orange walls. She was excited. She'd made plans to visit with her son that weekend, but everything changed when she contacted her estranged husband and he canceled the visit. Angry, Susan picked up the phone and called her lawyer. That was when she got the exciting news she'd been waiting for since nearly the beginning of the year. The court had finally scheduled a date for their child custody hearing for the morning of Tuesday, April 6th, in Tuscarawas County Common Pleas Court. This was a big deal for Sue, who could now count down the days to the hearing where she was certain she'd get some form of custody and be able to see her son again without Alan controlling the schedule. After finishing the first coat of paint, Sue got cleaned up and ready for work. She planned to do the second coat when she got back. Unfortunately, Sue would never return home, as her mother later stated, quote, "Her last words to me before leaving were, 'I'm going to that custody hearing.' But Susan never made it." End quote. When Sue left the house that evening, she took little with her. Leaving behind her money, ID, and purse, she climbed into her parents' car and made the short 1-mile drive northeast from the family's Wood Avenue home to Thompson's IGA, then located at 316 South College Street, where it meets East State Street. The building is still there, and today the store is known as Riesbeck's Food Market. Approximately 2 hours into Sue's shift, around 6 p.m., her father, Jim, stopped into the store to pick up food for dinner. While there, he went to the deli counter where Susan worked, and the two had a small chat before he left, telling her that he'd see her when he got home. Jim would later state that when he left that night, he saw Sue's car parked in the lot. According to everything that is known from coworkers, the night went along as per usual, and nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. If anything, Susan seemed upbeat given the news about the upcoming custody hearing. Sue was usually home fairly quickly after her shift ended, being only 1 mile away. So when she didn't arrive by 9:15, her parents thought she might have stopped off somewhere or needed to work late. However, when 10 p.m. came and went, and no sign of Susan and no calls from her, they started to get concerned. Worried that perhaps she had some kind of car trouble, Jim and Judy made the short drive over to the IGA, where they found Sue's car parked in the same place it had been when Jim dropped by hours earlier. It was then the only car still in the parking lot. Unsure of what to do at the time, the Wolffs returned home and hoped that they would hear from Sue. After a long and sleepless night, when the IGA opened up the next morning, they called in to find out if anything had gone on the night before. No one seemed to be aware of any issues, and the Wolffs were provided with a list of people with whom Sue had worked the previous night. While most people hadn't seen anything strange, one coworker had. Teresa Shepard was getting off that night at the same time as Susan. The two chatted as they clocked out and walked out of the store together. According to Shepard, she was waiting for a ride from her husband, so Sue stood with her and the two talked. In the middle of their conversation, an older model, light blue and rusty car pulled into the lot. It slowly crept forward, stopping beside Susan, at which time the driver said something to her. Shepard went on to say that Sue spoke to the driver, who she never got a good look at. She then turned back towards Shepard and made a face, which Shepard interpreted as annoyance or disgust. Regardless of the look, Sue then walked around the front of the car, opened the passenger side door, and took a seat. According to Shepard, at that point, the car drove out of the parking lot, and that was the last time she, or presumably anyone other than that driver, ever saw Susan Wolff Cappel again. At precisely 9:21 a.m. on Wednesday, March 17th, just over 12 hours since Susan climbed into the blue car with the unknown driver, Jim and Judy Wolff contacted the Newcomerstown Police Department to report their daughter missing. At the time, the department was headed up by Chief John Lawver alongside Assistant Chief Ray Russell, who was subsequently put in charge of the investigation. Detectives followed up in much the way the Wolff family had, by interviewing co-workers, including Teresa Shepard. While they had somewhat of a description of the vehicle, Shepard couldn't recall a lot of details, and even after a hypnosis session, was unable to provide any information about the driver. Given the circumstances, police at the time were unsure what they were dealing with. While officially, they had no evidence to suggest a crime had occurred, they also had nothing solid to confirm that Sue had planned to leave the area. Yet, for the most part, the initial reports given by police to local reporters was that they believed it was entirely possible that the 19-year-old mother of one may have planned to run away. This, of course, being done without her ID, clothing, or cash. In addition to these items, all left behind at her parents' home were also 2 uncashed paychecks and a half-painted room she had planned to share with her son. Clearly, she was looking to get out of town. Assistant Chief Russell confirmed that, following interviews with friends and family, they next hoped to speak with Sue's estranged husband, Alan Cappel, who at the time was living in Port Washington, just 6 miles northeast from Newcomerstown. This apparently took several days, as investigators did not report speaking with Cappel until the afternoon of Monday, March 22nd. However, according to Chief Lawver, Cappel offered no useful information, stated he hadn't seen his wife in days, and had no idea of where she may have gone. Everyone was split, for the most part. While Sue's family were of the firm belief that she would not have run away, especially during a time where things were finally starting to work in her favor, local police couldn't really say one way or the other. Newcomerstown patrolman Jim Friel explained to the Dover Times reporter, saying, quote, "We can't suspect anything at this time because there is no definite evidence of foul play." End quote. While this was true, Assistant Chief Russell wasn't ready to write off any possibilities revolving around foul play. A runaway situation to him just didn't make sense. He stated, quote, "Some parents are fooled by their kids. They think their kids are perfect, but the real story is something altogether different. This wasn't one of those cases. From all we've found, Susan was a clean kid. She wouldn't have had time for anything else. Between the 2 jobs she worked and the rest of her schedule, she must not have had any more than 10 free hours a week." End quote. For the next 2 weeks, the family did the best they could. They tried to keep a strong front while doing everything in their power to get the story out. They knew the faster they could get Susan's story in the media, the better chances were of someone seeing her or remembering having seen her. Tuesday, March 30th, not only marked 2 weeks since Sue disappeared, but it was also the day of her 20th birthday. It was a difficult milestone for the family who were struggling to keep it together. Sleepless nights, constant stress, and endless worry. When they weren't out looking for Sue, they were at home devising new ways to try and find her. While many in the community were divided, they remained steadfast in their belief that Susan would never have run away. Jim explained their thoughts to the Times reporter, saying, quote, "It doesn't make any sense at all that she would run away. She was just starting to get her feet back on the ground. She was working, saving a little money, and looking forward to getting custody of her child. On the day she disappeared, she was upstairs repainting the room for her son. And a girl without a purse, money, ID, or makeup doesn't run away. She didn't have any of those things. It just doesn't add up." End quote. Police, asked about the status of the investigation, essentially confirmed that not much, if any, progress had been made. They had a missing woman, that much was known, but whether or not it was due to her own choice was something no one could prove one way or the other. Investigators noted that the witness at the supermarket that night did not say Sue was forced, nor did she seem to be getting into the car against her will. That, combined with a lack of suspects, motive, and clues, left them with little more information than the family themselves had. In hopes of stirring things up, the Wolff family announced they were offering a reward of $500 for information leading to Sue's location. The family started putting up flyers showing photos of Sue, giving her description and the circumstances of her disappearance. The flyer, under the headline of "Missing Mom," provided the Wolff's home phone number, as they were beginning to get the feeling that perhaps local authorities weren't putting everything into the search that they had. They spread the flyers all throughout Newcomers Town, then surrounding towns, then the entire Tuscarawas Valley region. They put notices in the paper asking for anyone traveling out of the state who wouldn't mind bringing flyers with them to put up along the way. They wanted Sue's face seen from coast to coast on the chance that someone, anyone, might recognize her. They received frequent calls from people who had seen the flyers, many of whom called in with tips, information, or support. However, many of the calls came collect, racking up high monthly phone bills for the family. On Tuesday, April 6th, Jim and Judy Wolff arrived in court for Sue's custody hearing. They were deeply concerned that if Sue wasn't around before the hearing, that the judge might simply grant full custody to Alan in her absence, but that didn't happen. Judge Harlan Spies granted temporary custody to Alan, but the child has to be kept by his aunt in Zanesville until 90 days passed or until they could hold another hearing, at which point, hopefully, Sue would be present. Alan's aunt, Joanne Hiveden, a registered nurse, testified that his son was in good condition, both mentally and physically, and that Alan had paid her $100 in support and medical expenses. In addition to this, Judge Spies appointed Judy Wolff as a legal guardian of the child and granted her and Jim visitation rights. 1 week later, Newcomers Town Police Chief John Lawver told the Tribune that his office was essentially done with the case and that the next moves would need to be made by County Prosecutor Ron Collins. Lawver went on to say that they had sent bulletins about the case and Sue to all law enforcement agencies statewide, and that all evidence acquired during the investigation had been turned over to Collins' office. Lawver stated that he advised Collins to subpoena all parties involved to testify before the grand jury. Despite this statement, issues between Chief Lawver and Assistant Chief Russell in regard to Sue's investigation were about to boil over and become front-page news. Towards the end of April, Assistant Chief Russell stated that a witness had contacted investigators to say she had seen Sue near her parents' home on Monday, April 26th. The witness, a 15-year-old sister of one of Sue's friends, told police she saw the missing woman sitting in a blue car next to her estranged husband on Wood Avenue. According to the witness, Sue had changed her hairstyle and was now wearing a perm. Another sighting was reported weeks earlier by Timothy Lewis, owner of U.S. Alarms in Canton. Lewis claimed to have seen Sue behind the Board of Realtors building. She was allegedly sitting in a brown Trans Am or Firebird. Lewis stated that the woman was between 75 to 100 feet from him at the time, and according to Russell, the witness identified Sue by her picture on the missing mom flyers. Neither sighting was ever confirmed. Following reports of these sightings, the Wolff family increased the reward available for information from $500 to $1,500. A few weeks later, in early June, all hell broke loose from inside the Newcomerstown Police Department. Assistant Chief Ray Russell tendered his resignation, citing issues with Chief Lawver as the primary reason. Reportedly, on Friday, April 9th, Russell had taken $350 from the Wolff family's reward fund to pay a confidential informant whose information never panned out. Chief Lawver, who had been on vacation at the time, claimed he had been completely unaware of the payment and that his first knowledge of it came on Tuesday, May 25th, when a memo dated May 9th was put on his desk. 2 days later, on Thursday, May 27th, Chief Lawver confronted Russell and ordered him to give the $350 back to the Wolff family and to provide him with the name and address of the confidential informant. He gave Russell until 7 p.m. the next day to hand over the information, but Russell refused. Russell defended the payment, even though the information did not deliver anything helpful, telling the Tribune, quote, "This was the first real information anyone had given us," end quote. Russell then resigned and refused to give out any more information, telling Lawver that he had given the informant until June 4th to return the money since the lead did not produce. Lawver, however, stated that Russell was exerting authority he did not have and breached operating policy by withholding tips from a superior officer. Russell, who had become assistant chief in 1981, said he was not the first, nor would he be the last officer to leave the department because of Chief Lawver. At a meeting of the village council, Chief Lawver issued a request that the incident be examined and the money returned to the Wolff family. A few weeks later, the council concluded their analysis and the $350 was returned. However, this incident in and of itself was one clear example of what the family had felt was a problem since the beginning. The investigation was not being handled properly, and disputes from within the department were now infecting the search for Sue. August 16th marked 5 months since Sue had vanished, and no one appeared to be any closer to finding the answers. Law enforcement still sat on the fence about whether or not this was the result of foul play or if Susan had elected to run off that night, as illogical as that idea seems. Judy Wolff spoke with the Denver Times reporter about her grief and pain as their grandson's second birthday approached. She explained, quote, "We are a very close family. We celebrate birthdays, have reunions, and a lot of picnics. Our daughter loved her son dearly and did not run away as some have suggested. Susan is missing this important part of his life. We have a double tragedy. Not only is our daughter missing, but a little boy is missing his mother at a time in his life when he really needs a mother. Let's face it, other people can't take that place no matter how hard they try. We visit the baby and he runs to us with open arms. We still have their room ready. Can you imagine what it would be like to grow up and not know your real mom? That's what he's facing. My daughter is his mother and no one can take that place. We don't know if that little boy will ever see his real mommy, and that is very sad." End quote. During this interview, Judy revealed something which had previously never been mentioned. She told the reporter that her daughter, 2 months before her disappearance in March, had told her in January that she thought she was being followed by a blue car. Whether or not it was the same one she got into the night she vanished is unknown. Frustrated with the lack of progress, Judy threw herself into trying to get the ball rolling. She began writing letters to local papers and national ones, reaching out to television news programs and contacting different organizations which all dealt with missing persons. She found herself overwhelmed by the vast amount of missing persons and how many of their cases had little or no information. She explained, quote, "It is such a terrible shame that you can find a lost car easier than you can find a lost person. I am haunted by her memory. I look at this house, and every room I walk in has something of Susan's." End quote. In October of 1982, 7 months after the disappearance, Jim and Judy appeared on local Cleveland station WUAB-TV, where they discussed the case and expressed their frustration with seeing how little coordination there was between law enforcement agencies when it came to missing persons. They hoped that by telling their story and getting Sue's face out there on the news, someone might come forward. It seemed apparent by this point that the Wolff family had lost faith in local law enforcement. Unfortunately, the year of 1982 would come to a conclusion with no new information, no clues, no sightings, and no concept of what happened to Sue nor who was driving that blue car. In early March of 1983, less than a week before the one-year mark of Sue's disappearance, Chief John Lawver wrote a letter to the editor in which he discussed several issues with his department. In this letter, he made mention of Sue's case, writing, quote, "I feel bad that I have been unable to find the whereabouts of Susan Wolff Cappel, who has been missing these past 12 months. Mr. and Miss James Wolff might not believe this, but I do wish I could have found her whereabouts. I have 2 daughters, so I am fully aware of how parents might feel." End quote. This seems to have done little to quell the negative environment between the Wolffs and the Newcomerstown police chief. On March 16th, the Dover Times reporter released a long article discussing developments in the case over the previous year. In discussion with Judy Wolff, it was revealed that over the previous year, they themselves had tracked down several leads which had been called into their home phone. One of those tips had come from a truck driver who had seen a flyer and believed he had seen Sue in New Jersey. The Wolffs contacted New Jersey law enforcement and traveled to the state, but in the end, while the woman resembled Sue, it turned out to be a case of mistaken identity. Things had moved along with their grandson as well, as after living with his father's aunt in Zanesville, he had lived for a time with his uncle before Alan took him back into his custody and moved into a new home. When reached for comment about the case, Alan elected not to answer questions and instead directed the reporter to his lawyer, James Barnhouse of New Philadelphia. Barnhouse stated that his client had no knowledge of Sue's whereabouts and assumed that she would eventually return, saying that Alan, too, was concerned about her safety. Chief Lawver stated that while the investigation was still open, there had been no active leads in quite a while. Lawver said that his department was working in conjunction with the Tuscarawas County Sheriff's Department, which was confirmed by Captain Joe Zaylor, who stated that they had checked many reported sightings of Sue, but none of them had ever panned out. However, another interesting piece of information came out in this same article. As it turned out, in the months following Sue's disappearance, there had been a grand jury convened and several people were called to testify. County Prosecutor Richard Fox, who headed up the investigation, was not able to offer comment since the case was still open and all information revealed at the grand jury is to be kept confidential. For Judy and Jim, times were getting tougher. While they tried to maintain their optimism about their daughter returning safely, the passage of time makes that much more difficult. For Jim, it wasn't a question, as he explained that unless a body was found, he wasn't yet willing to say his daughter might be dead. For Judy, things were a little different, as she explained, quote, "I'll be honest with you. I don't think that my daughter is alive, but I'll never stop looking. I've buried her in my mind, so I live with the worst and hope for the best." End quote. At the time, the family was working with Cobra Connection, a Canton-based organization designed to provide assistance to the families of missing children. Despite their own doubts about Sue still being alive, The family continued to leave their back porch light burning every night from the time of her disappearance, hoping against hope that it might shine her way back home. Judy explained the light, saying, quote, "It's become a symbol. The neighbors, they're all praying for the day they can look out and see that back porch light off. If she's dead or alive, we need an answer." End quote. Rumors circulated about what might have happened to Sue. One particularly prominent rumor revolved around a buried freezer on property in Gilmore, 13 miles east of Newcomerstown. On Monday, May 9, 1983, investigators arrived at the Gilmore property to follow up on several tips they had received. According to Sheriff's Captain Joe Zaylor, the rumor had begun after a property owner went to clean out a house that he had previously rented. In the home, he found spoiled meat in the freezer, and the scent of it was intolerable. Contacting a local environmentalist named Earl Paulus, the property owner was advised that the best way to dispose of the freezer would be by burying it. When people saw this happening, they began to wonder what else might be in that freezer. Using a backhoe, the freezer was found approximately 1 foot beneath the surface and appeared to have chunks of rotten meat, fish, and pork inside. In hopes of quashing all the rumors, investigators dug an additional 4 feet beneath where the freezer had been and widened out the hole, only to find no trace of Sue or anyone else. Samples of the meat were sent to the lab, where it was confirmed to be non-human. The freezer was then put back in the earth, and the hole was covered over. Then, there was the strange rumor that Sue might have been abducted, forced to ingest a lethal dose of drugs, possibly cocaine, before her body was thrown down an old well. Where exactly this originated from is uncertain, though it's typical of the kinds of stories people tell when terrible things happen. Perhaps the rumor which garnered the most attention revolved around property owned by the Cappel family along Gravel Lick Road, approximately 10 miles east of Newcomerstown. This rumor suggested that Alan had been involved in Sue's disappearance, and her body had been placed in a gas well pit on that property. On 2 separate occasions, investigators had gone to the property and conducted digs, but nothing was ever recovered. 4 months later, in late September, Judge Roger Lyle officially granted Alan a divorce from Sue, along with full custody of their now 3-year-old son. The judge also ordered that Sue's belongings be returned to her family and that Cappel assume all debts that had been acquired by the couple up until March 11, 1982. In addition to this, Judge Lyle granted Jim and Judy Wolff visitation rights with their grandson. 5 months later, Alan Cappel would remarry. In February of 1984, the Wolff family's frustrations with the Newcomerstown Police Department boiled to a head. In a letter written to the editor by Judy Wolff, she sharply called out Chief John Lawver for the poor job he had done in investigating Susan's disappearance. The letter was spurred on by an article which had detailed a story of how Lawver had been in New Philadelphia when a vehicle smashed into 2 buildings and fled the scene. Acting quickly, Lawver caught the vehicle's license plate and was able to furnish that information to investigators. Judy Wolff, in her letter to the editor, wrote, in part, quote, "Everyone probably knows by now that our daughter, Susan Wolff Cappel, was last seen entering a blue car on the night of her controversial disappearance of March 16, 1982. Many of our friends, neighbors, and relatives were very observant of all blue cars in the area after that night, and in fact, did call me or our local police department to report their license numbers. I very naively assumed the police were checking these cars and were even taking one eyewitness to look at them, since she had stated she would be more than willing to do this to help us determine if the car might still be in the area. Well, I received a very rude awakening in June 1982 when I contacted Chief Lawver to report a license number of a blue car to him, and also asked at that time what they were doing about any of these cars, since this was the only tangible evidence we had in our daughter's disappearance. He then proceeded to inform me emphatically that they most certainly did not have the time or the manpower to check any of these cars with the eyewitness. It is probably very comforting to the citizens of Newcomerstown to know that somebody in the county is being protected by their chief of police, even if it isn't the town where he is employed." End quote. 1 month later, March came around again, and the Wolff family had to confront the fact that their beloved daughter and sister had now been missing for 2 years. In that time, no solid evidence was found and no leads provided any assistance. Asked about the possibility that Susan had chosen to leave, Judy was quick to dismiss it. She pointed out how her daughter had taken nothing, no money, no clothes, not even the car she was driving. She explained, quote, "That very morning, she disappeared. Sue received a call that her custody hearing date had been set. She was on cloud 9. Everything was going her way. I could deal with this if I knew for sure she was dead. But how can someone deal with this without going crazy?" End quote. Over the previous 2 years, Judy explained, they had spent thousands of dollars on the search for Sue, money that wasn't easily available for them. Jim, then employed at General Tire and Rubber, had missed a lot of days of work traveling around the country to follow up on possible sightings. The couple had previously hired on 3 private investigators, desperately hoping they might be able to find something that everyone else had missed. According to Judy, the failure to find something was due in part to a lack of cooperation from local law enforcement. She explained, quote, "This all runs into money. We've hired 3 investigators, but the cooperation between them and local police is weak. We are constantly looking for her, but the biggest frustration is the lack of cooperation among the local officials. What gets me is they say there's not a thing they can do." End quote. For their part, the sheriff's department stated that they followed up on all leads, but they hadn't had a lead in quite some time. The case, which remained open, was essentially inactive due to a lack of any information to move forward with. The family saw it differently, believing the poor investigation and lack of developments was more about egos and jurisdictions than finding the answers. Jim stated, quote, "No one seems interested in finding the truth. No one is sharing information because they do not want to share the glory. I feel betrayed. The whole system stinks." End quote. Despite having to essentially take on and fund the entire investigation themselves, the Wolffs tried to put their anger with local police on the back burner, choosing instead to use their energy in attempts to locate Sue. They managed to get her photo shown on all the major news stations in Ohio and even some in West Virginia. They worked with at least 2 psychics, one from Cleveland, another from Chicago, who shockingly weren't able to come up with anything useful. They put up more flyers in town, surrounding towns, across the state and across the country. Nothing. Yet neither was ready to give up, with Judy telling the Tribune, quote, "Until I find out what happened to her, I'll keep looking. It's a running job writing letters, calling television stations and newspapers until someone helps me." End quote. In yet another series of letters to the editor, one local wrote in asking why there had been no movement on Sue's case, while a very similar case had led to an arrest and conviction. When Dolores Jeannie Nicely went missing, the prime suspect quickly became her husband, Donald. In July of 1985, County Prosecutor Ron Collins took the case to court, and a lot of stories were written about the overwhelming task he had in front of him: to prove a murder had been committed, even though no body had been found. 2 different letters to the editor asked why a similar approach hadn't been done in Sue's case, as she was also a missing woman whose body hadn't been recovered, and yet in her case, the prosecutor's office hadn't moved forward, primarily noting a lack of evidence and the failure to locate a body. One letter read in part, quote, "It appears to us there is a double standard in this county where missing persons are concerned, and we can't help but wonder why so much effort was put forth by prosecutors in the Nicely case, and yet in another one, nobody has even been taken into custody, let alone charged with a crime. We also question why a special investigator was appointed in the Nicely case. In the Cappel case, the parents have had to assume all financial responsibility for paying for investigators. Is justice really being served in Tuscarawas County? And if so, at whose expense is it being served?" End quote. This set off a stream of other letters, many asking similar questions, while others argued that there was vastly more evidence in the Nicely case than there was in Susan's. Judy took umbrage to those who would question what evidence is and is not available for investigators. She wrote a response letter saying in part, quote, "I disagree with some of the statements in the letters written to the editors by the families of Jeannie and Donald Nicely in regard to my missing daughter, Susan Wolff Cappel. I think these letters have been misleading in that they have conjectured about the evidence or lack of evidence in my daughter's case as compared to the Nicely case. Since my daughter's disappearance never got beyond the grand jury, the only persons who can possibly know how much evidence was presented would be the grand jury members, the prosecutor, Mr. Collins, and the assistant prosecutor, Mr. Fox. Before people make any more conclusions about my daughter's disappearance, as Mr. Hotstetler did in his letter, I think they should check the facts more carefully. I know everything that happened to my daughter prior to her disappearance, and there isn't a single fact that would point to her being a runaway. Yes, to keep my sanity, I sometimes try to convince myself she is alive somewhere. However, those I have spoken to, law enforcement personnel and private investigators in many states, have told me they think my daughter is dead. These are people who have had many years' experience dealing with this type of situation. Apparently, the local authorities also believe this is a definite possibility, as they are still contacting us when they get the report of an unidentified body which they think could match our daughter's description. If either of these two families, or anyone else, would be interested in knowing the real circumstances of my daughter's disappearance, I would discuss them with you, as I strongly feel there are still many misconceptions surrounding her disappearance." End quote. This letter seemed to put a stop to debates in the letters to the editors section, at least in regard to the Nicely murder and Sue's disappearance, but it certainly wouldn't be the last time Sue's case was brought up. March 16th, 1986, marked 4 years since Sue had last been seen. Throughout that time, Judy Wolff had become heavily involved in activism and politics related to missing persons. She testified on a planned missing persons bill, helped to establish the month between Mother's Day and Father's Day as Family Reunion Month in the state of Ohio, and worked hard to push through a grandparents' Bill of Rights out of concern for their own rights regarding their grandson. According to Judy, their grandson was living at the time with his father in Tippecanoe, 21 miles east of Newcomerstown. According to the family, they were able to see their grandson twice a month. The Wolffs continued posting flyers and, as a result, continued to receive calls from all around the country from people who believed they had seen the missing woman. After the previously discussed New Jersey excursion, they had been to Nevada following up on an anonymous tip, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, after a mail carrier reported delivering to a woman named Susan Wolff, though the last name was spelled differently, as W-O-L-F-E instead of W-O-L-F-F. Still needing to know, they made the trip and ultimately found a different woman who was not their daughter. While Judy was pushing through and doing everything she could to try and find her daughter, and along the way, assisting other families in similar positions, Jim was struggling to maintain the pace necessary. He supported his wife, but much of his activities were in the background or in order to assist her otherwise. He had tried to keep busy, taking on night classes in hopes of obtaining an associate's degree in electrical engineering. He explained to the Dover Times reporter, saying, quote, "You never stop thinking about it. You can't drop it. You can't let it go. It's something that is always there. It's still an unanswered question. It's like it's a baseball game, and I'm the batter, the umpire, and the cheering section, and the game just keeps getting longer and longer. I'm just plain wearing out. I don't know how much longer I can keep on cheering and playing. I just don't know. I'm just tired. Everyone says that time heals. It doesn't heal it. It hurts just as much today as it did day one." End quote. By this point, 4 years after, the investigation had grown fairly cold. However, 2 new investigators would take it on, those being Sheriff Detective Dale Gowans and Newcomerstown Police Sergeant John Douglas. Obtaining the case in November of '85, the two had a difficult road ahead of them, which would include re-interviewing many witnesses, some of whom had unfortunately passed away before they could be questioned again. Sergeant Douglas was pretty blunt with his thoughts, telling reporters that much of the reason the case was unsolved was because of how screwed up it was by authorities in the early days. For his part, Douglas blamed primarily one man, former Chief of Police John Lawver. Douglas stated, quote, "Lawver did not want the case to be worked on because as far as he was concerned, the matter was to an end." End quote. According to Douglas, who had worked under Chief Lawver, he had to work on this case in secret because in Lawver's mind, they'd handed all their evidence over to the prosecutors and their investigation was complete. Former patrolman Jim Friel, previously mentioned, was promoted to Chief of Police in late 1985, and when Douglas approached him about Sue's case, Friel was confused as to why he needed to ask permission to work on it. Lawver had previously stated that the investigation had been worked extensively under his leadership. He said they had contacted the FBI and the prosecutor's office, the sheriff's department, and other agencies. Lawver denied Douglas's account, saying, quote, "Everything was done that could have been done. Anybody who had information worked on it." End quote. County Prosecutor Ron Collins couldn't say much about the case as he still considered it open and active, and instead noted that a grand jury probe was continuously being considered. Asked his thoughts on the case overall, Collins wouldn't take the bait, instead telling the reporter, quote, "I have my own opinions," end quote. Unfortunately, the case once again began falling into silence, at least on the part of law enforcement. As years began passing, the frustration felt by the family was overwhelming. They couldn't understand why it seemed to them that they were the only ones out there actively trying to find out what had happened. 2 years later, in February of 1988, Jim and Judy got a Cleveland television station to run a missing person story on Sue. They also announced an increase to their reward, now offering $10,000 for information leading to their daughter. Their next focal point was a popular true crime television series making waves on network TV, a show called Unsolved Mysteries. When Judy originally contacted producers of the show, they expressed interest in running a segment on Sue's story. However, months later, they notified the family that they had opted not to run the segment and were moving on with different cases. Judy began a letter writing campaign, which included a letter to the editor of the Tribune in which she asked for everyone in Newcomerstown to call and write Unsolved Mysteries in hopes that they could pressure the show into putting together a segment on the case. 1 year later, in October of 1989, Unsolved Mysteries did touch on Sue's case, but she didn't get a segment. Instead, her photo was shown and details of her disappearance were listed. The family was frustrated with this as Unsolved Mysteries gave the local police number instead of their home number, and Sue had been titled as Susan Cappel instead of Susan Wolff Cappel. Regardless, while it wasn't what they wanted, they thought any help is good. County Sheriff Harold McKimmey said that following the Unsolved Mysteries airing, they had received 5 fresh calls with tips on the case. The calls had come from Texas, New Jersey, Canada, and Ohio. While Sheriff McKimmey said they were in the process of checking out the leads, it doesn't appear that any solid evidence or information was discerned from these calls. March 16, 1992, marked a full decade since Sue had vanished, and still, it seemed, investigators were no closer to finding answers, assuming someone was actively looking for them. For the Wolff family, the absence was still felt powerfully, and they couldn't deny it. It had forever changed their lives, and even they themselves. Judy explained that so much of their pain lingered in the darkness of the unknown, alive or dead, safe or harmed. What had happened to their daughter? She explained, quote, "If I just knew that she was all right. It's this terrible, terrible not knowing that's the worst of all. I've changed so much. I don't look at anything the same. I know when my kids call me on the phone, I make sure I tell them I love you, because I never had a chance to tell my daughter that I loved her. You just want to say I love you so much, and you're so important to me." End quote. 2 years later, In January of 1994, accomplished author and journalist Martin Yant came upon an article about Susan's disappearance. Finding himself frustrated with the lack of information, he decided to dig in, and during the process, constructed a detailed article which essentially walked people through how the case had been handled. Yant was less than impressed by what he saw, telling the Daily Jeffersonian, quote, "I've worked on criminal cases all over the country since my book, Presumed Guilty, came out in 1991, and I can't say I've ever seen a more poorly done criminal investigation. Jim Friel and Larry McKinney did a good job in the initial stages, and then, for some reason, were taken off the case, and the file just seems to stop." End quote. Yant stated that conflicts between former Chief Lawver and former Sheriff Lou Clark, combined with conflicts between jurisdictions, damaged the case severely. According to Yant, other than a few files here and there, the bulk of the investigation seems to have stopped just 6 days after Susan was reported missing. His ire wasn't reserved only for those two agencies, as he also pointed a finger at prosecutor Ron Collins, who he claimed lost all of the case files not once, but on 2 separate occasions. Yant stated, quote, "I think that's typical of how this case was handled. I think the case could have been resolved in 1982, and I think any parent should be concerned that a daughter can disappear and have the case as mishandled by local officials as this one was. Dozens of leads were not followed." End quote. Ron Collins admitted that his first file on the case had been misplaced, but denied it had happened a second time. According to Collins, along with the assistance of Sheriff's Detective Jeff Cady, they managed to reconstruct the files. According to Yant, several people reported that they were offered money to either kidnap or murder Susan prior to her disappearance. Who these people were and who offered the money has never been revealed. Following his investigation, Yant handed all files and information over to both the Newcomerstown Police and the Sheriff's Department, both of whom he noted had been very cooperative and had given him access to files. The road was far less smooth with the prosecutor's office, as Yant explained, quote, "Mr. Collins's response was quite different. When it seemed no progress was being made as a result, I decided to write this story." End quote. Despite all of the time, effort, and money which had been poured into the investigation by private investigators, Martin Yant, the Wolffs themselves, and local authorities to some degree, the 1990s would come to an end without any solid developments, leads, or any new information. March 16th, 2002 marked 20 years since anyone had seen, spoken with, or heard from Sue. It was beginning to seem like there was no hope. That month, the family announced they were once again increasing the reward for information, this time to $20,000. Asked about the reward, Judy explained that it was, quote, "for information leading to her whereabouts, whether dead or alive. Just give us that information. Tell me where she is. Just give us some kind of proof one way or the other." End quote. 1 year later, a tragic accident would seemingly blow the lid off much of the investigation into Sue's disappearance, and the accusations of suspicion began flying. On Thursday, September 4th, 2003, Alan Cappel and a co-worker from the Ohio Department of Transportation were killed when a truck slammed into their car along Route 250 at New Philadelphia, where they were inspecting a highway project. Just 10 days later, a massive article was published in the Dover New Philadelphia Times Reporter. The article, which had been started prior to Cappel's death, dug deep into many of the accusations that had been whispered about, but never saw the light of publication. According to the Wolff family, they had always believed that Alan had been involved somehow in Sue's disappearance, and reportedly, much of the case file assembled by investigators followed a similar trajectory. The hope was that at some point he might share something that he knew. Following his death, that was impossible, but Judy didn't think he'd have been talking if he was alive anyway. She explained, quote, "I know a lot of people think if Alan did know anything, it went to the grave with him. I won't say that didn't go through my mind, but I had a friend tell me that after 21 years, he probably wasn't going to say anything anyway. They should have made him tell 21 years ago. I still feel that was a horrible miscarriage of justice." End quote. Prior to his death, Allen had been interviewed for the article where he reiterated previous statements that he believed Sue was alive and safe and would someday return to answer all of the questions people had been asking for the 2 previous decades. He also suggested that investigators had wasted valuable time and resources digging into him when they should have been looking elsewhere. He stated, quote, "Several of the deputies who worked on this case have passed away. One of them told me they felt the case would have been solved in a week or so if they had had an open mind and not tunnel vision. He didn't say tunnel vision on me, but that's how I took it. He said, we just kept kicking the same briar patch and nothing came out of it." End quote. Now the hope was, if indeed Allen had any information, that perhaps he shared it with someone else. The Wolff family believed it was possible someone might come forward with what they knew now that he had passed, believing that they had previously kept quiet out of fear of reprisals. While she hadn't wished for it, Judy noted that Allen's death did not provide any resolution for the family. She explained, quote, "It still doesn't answer our questions about what happened to Susan. I don't know how to react. I didn't want Allen Cappel dead, but I didn't feel extreme grief. It's very hard to deal with because I have very conflicting emotions. We have 2 boys here who've lost their father. I hope Allen made his peace with the Lord. Only the Lord and Allen know what happened. He never made his peace with me. He never told me he was sorry. That doesn't mean I'm going to stop looking for my daughter. I am going to continue." End quote. For the first time, Judy and Jim also revealed what they believed might have happened and who they theorized could have been involved beyond Allen himself. According to the Wolffs, in 1983, they received a call from a Greyhound bus driver who claimed he had dropped off a woman who he believed to be Susan. This woman, according to the driver, was coming into Newcomerstown from Reno, Nevada by way of Cleveland. According to the driver, the woman appeared somewhat disheveled and had nothing more than a small satchel with her. The woman reportedly asked to be dropped off at a nearby truck stop gas station, but the driver refused, noting that the location was closed and he couldn't drop her at a spot that wasn't designated as a bus stop. The driver continued on to the normal stop, not far from the filling station, and said the woman exited the bus and took off running straight towards that station. At the time of Susan's disappearance, a man named Patrick Parrish had worked at that station and drove an older model blue Plymouth Satellite. Parrish, along with his cousin Robert Parrish, was good friends with Allen Cappel. It was theorized that either Allen borrowed the car and was the one who drove into the IGA parking lot that night, or perhaps that one of the cousins was the driver. The Wolffs theorized that Sue might have been threatened, perhaps told to leave town or harm would come to both her son and her family. Whether or not there was any legitimacy to the theories could never be proven, as just 2 weeks after Sue disappeared, the Parrish cousins, along with another friend, were killed in a car accident. Patrick was, that day, driving the blue Plymouth, and it was destroyed. There didn't appear to be a ton of solid evidence pointing towards either of the Parrish cousins, but in the absence of anything, even the slimmest possibility seems reliable. Whether or not they were involved or were needlessly maligned because of the people they kept company with has never been determined, and given the situation, likely never will be. The publication of these names for the first time resulted in a slew of letters to the editor in which friends and family of the Parrishes noted their kindness, friendliness, and their firm belief that neither man would have ever participated in a crime that harmed another person, let alone Susan. Asked how she handled the unknowing more than 2 decades later, Judy stated, quote, "Things are different now, 21 years later, but I'll never be over it. I don't know if I've lost a child or not. There is a place for death, and you grieve. But what do you do with someone who's missing? What do I do?" End quote. 3 years later, in June of 2006, retired police sergeant Tom Lewes Sr. formed the Cold Case Unit of the Kentucky Society of Professional Investigators with the plan of examining decades-old cases in hopes of finding new information. After seeing a photograph of Jim and Judy holding a picture of Sue, Luz believed that the case should be there first. He stated that members of the group, comprised of 50 investigators and retired police officers, would be seeing what they could turn up in Newcomers Town, free of charge. Luz reached out to both the sheriff's department and the local police, who, according to him, were more than happy to have some assistance. Tuscarawas County Detective Captain Otis Campbell said his agency officially took over Sue's case after the Newcomers Town Police Department expressed no interest in pursuing it any further. Campbell was asked about cooperating with Luz's organization, to which he replied, quote, "We've dug up property in old wells and interviewed tons of people over the years, and this family has been contacted by many private investigators and paid out tons of money over the years. So, I feel this family has been through so much, it can't do any harm. Luz promised never to charge a penny for anything, so I said there's nothing to lose. We absolutely support you because these people need some resolution. It has affected them their entire lives." End quote. Luz acknowledged it would be a challenge, as many people previously tied to the case and in the case files have passed away, and that they needed to locate and question approximately 100 people. He also made note that most of the grand jury records had been lost. Luz stated his team planned to return to the former Cappel farm, where 2 previous digs had been conducted, though they planned to take cadaver dogs with them. Asked about Allen and the parishes, Captain Campbell stated that the files showed Patrick Parish had driven an older model blue car similar to the one Sue was seen getting into, and that investigators had suspected from the early part of the case that one or both of the parishes might have been involved. 2 months after getting involved, in August of 2006, Tom Luz's group had a billboard placed along Route 250, which showed a picture of Susan as she appeared in 1982, along with information about the $20,000 reward available for information leading to her whereabouts. Luz's investigation retreaded work previously done by others, with his team returning to the farmland in Gilmore. According to Luz, they had received information that Sue's body may have been disposed of in a cave in that area. The team found the cave system quite deteriorated from the way it had been in 1982, but still sent a team through with camera equipment to cover every inch of it. Despite finding nothing during their search, Luz would not rule out a possible return, perhaps to utilize sonar equipment. Luz was dedicated to finding answers, but the team found themselves hitting the same walls and dead ends that previous investigations had. Luz told reporters he was confident that there were other people in the area who had information they were choosing not to bring forward, and it was his goal to ensure that all of that information came to light. Asked his overall thoughts on the case and how it was handled, Luz replied, quote, "We have lots of leads. We recently came back from Gilmore, where we had a strong lead. It's been rumored for years that Susan's body is in a cave there. We literally crawled through that cave and took pictures." End quote. Unfortunately, whatever the team did manage to turn up, it never led to anything breaking through the case, and within a few months, everything began growing cold again. 8 years later, Jim and Judy Wolff would make an incredibly difficult but necessary decision. On Christmas Day, 2014, the couple officially petitioned the court to have Sue legally declared dead. On February 2nd, 2015, they were granted a hearing in Tuscarawas County Probate Court in New Philadelphia. Jim and Judy were both present, testifying before the court, as were previous and current investigators. Given what was known of the case, the lack of activity on Susan's Social Security number, and statements from police about the unlikelihood that she is still alive, the judge issued the decree, effective February 3rd. The last time a hearing had been held to declare a missing person deceased in Tuscarawas County was 21 years earlier in 1994. Now Chief Deputy Orvis Campbell was asked about how this declaration might impact his department's investigation. Campbell didn't think it would make much of a difference, saying, quote, We've followed up all the leads reported to us over the years. Some of them seemed more promising than others, but all of them ended without any developments in the case. We feel for the Wolff family's loss, and if any new information ever surfaces, we would certainly pursue it, even though she's been declared deceased." End quote. On Monday, July 6th, the family held a memorial service for Sue, specifically choosing that date, as July 6th was an important mark for their daughter. It was the day she officially joined their Lutheran church. William Higgins, a Lutheran pastor from Dover, came out and conducted the service. A notice was posted in the paper, and approximately 80 people showed up to pay their respects. A tombstone was erected at West Lawn Cemetery, just outside of Newcomerstown. On the far left of the stone is a picture of Sue, along with the words mother and daughter. Her official date of death is inscribed as March 17, 1982. Beside her are two nameplates, one for Jim and one for Judy, though both remain alive and strong today, fighting still to find the truth. And so we arrive to March 16th, 2022, 40 years to the day since Susan Wolff Cappel walked out of her job at the IGA, climbed into a blue car driven by an unknown person, and mysteriously vanished from the face of the earth. 4 long, difficult, and painful decades with no answers, no leads, no absolution. When they last saw their daughter, Jim was 44 years old and Judy was 43. Now, they are 84 and 83 years old, respectively. Together, the couple had spent nearly half of their entire lives searching desperately for their one and only daughter. They dealt with a lot over those years, not just their own family and personal grief, but also struggles with local law enforcement, disinterest from the national media, and countless calls and tips which, at the end of the day, were fraudulent attempts to get that $20,000 reward more than anything else. When it came to the actions of law enforcement, the Wolffs didn't have much positive to offer. They felt they had been betrayed in those early days, and for the most part, that sentiment was only enforced over years of inactivity and the discovery of what was going on behind the scenes. They did, however, want to pay respect to 2 officers, former Sheriff Harold McKimmy and one of his detectives, Jeff Cady, who Judy readily acknowledged had done a great deal for them. Despite the passage of 40 long years, the Wolffs had never stopped in their pursuit. While age may have slowed them down and health issues may have presented temporary blockades, neither intends to stop until they have no choice. As Jim succinctly put it, quote, "We still look," end quote. When last seen, Susan Diane Wolff Cappel was described as being a white female with brown hair and eyes, standing 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing approximately 107 pounds. Her upper right front tooth is crooked, and her upper left front tooth was discolored at the time of her disappearance. She has a scar on the upper right side of her lip, and she is right-handed. She also has a healed, fractured nose from a previous car accident. Susan was last seen wearing a white turtleneck sweater with brown stripes, a red smock with the letters IGA printed on the front, brown corduroy jeans, and reddish-brown Oxfords. She was carrying a blue nylon windbreaker. Her nickname is Sue, and if alive, she may use the last name Wolff, Cappel, or both in tandem. She was last seen getting into an older model blue car in the parking lot of what was then a Thompson's IGA, today a Riesbeck's Food Market, located at 316 South College Street, Newcomerstown, Ohio, on the evening of Tuesday, March 16, 1982. At the time of her disappearance, Sue was 19, and if alive today, she would now be 61 years old. Her son, who she last saw when he was 15 months old, is now 42. The disappearance of Susan Wolff Cappel continues to haunt the small village of Newcomerstown, where even decades later, the debate continues. Did Sue make some last-minute plan to run away from everything she seemingly wanted, or was she the victim of some yet undetermined crime? The answers have thus far proven difficult to locate, though if you ask Judy Wolff, at least one of those scenarios is foolish. All she wants is to bring her daughter home, to know the truth, and to finally be able to rest. She explained, quote, "As the years went by, I've thought I may have to face the fact that I may never have an answer to this. I may have to just learn to live with it. Just some closure is what I want. I just want to know whether she actually was killed, because people say they're still wondering whether she was killed. I just think, how stupid. But until they find a part of her body, I guess there'll always be doubt in people's minds that my daughter is dead, until they actually prove that she is. If Susan is dead, I can deal with that. I don't want to, but I can. We have places for birth and places for death, but where do you put that missing person?" The disappearance of Susan Wolff Cappel is an extremely frustrating and complex case. While we know some of what happened, there's never been much provided which can point in any particular direction. Sure, there are suspicions, rumors, and a lot of speculation, but there's no solid evidence to back most of it up. Now, it's debatable whether or not this impressive lack of evidence is as directly result of what happened that night, or if it's due at least in part to the seemingly half-assed way the former chief of police elected to handle things. From officers resigning over his behavior to others years later saying that they had to work the case in secret, it sounds like a proper investigation conducted with urgency and professionalism on that Tuesday night in March of 1982 may have actually had a solid chance of solving this case. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, or there may have been no need to ever record this episode. And that's the big problem. Here you have a family that's waiting, hoping for any possible news. Meanwhile, there's this shoddy investigation being overseen by someone who either didn't have the time, the interest, or the desire to put in everything that could be done. Regardless of how one views this case and the particular different theories, one thing is for certain. This case was remarkably bungled from the get-go, and as a result, a family continues to suffer with the unknown fate of their daughter and sister more than 40 years later. It would be humorous if it wasn't so absolutely enraging. A nice young woman, a new mother, going through a divorce and custody battle is putting her life back together. She moves back in with her parents, picks up 2 jobs, saves up what she can, buys supplies for her child, and begins painting the room they'll share. She finishes up the first coat, heads off to her 4 to 9 shift at the IGA, and never comes home. Less than 24 hours later, the whole town has been alerted and everyone is on the lookout, but no one sees Susan. Something hasn't changed in more than 4 decades. I suppose we can start by discussing what we actually do know about the case for certain, which sadly isn't a whole hell of a lot. After she put up the first coat of paint on her old bedroom walls, Susan spoke on the phone with her lawyer and received the news she'd been waiting for. Her child custody hearing finally had a date, and it was just 3 weeks away. Thrilled with this information, she got ready for her shift in the deli department of Thompson's IGA, borrowed her parents' car, and made the short 1-mile trip to South College Street. According to her father, he stopped by the store around 6 p.m. to pick up food for dinner. While there, he stopped by the deli department and chatted with Sue for a few minutes before heading home. He noted, as he was leaving, where Sue's car had been parked. Approximately 3 hours later, Sue's shift ends at 9 p.m. and she clocks out. As she's leaving, she talks with a coworker who's waiting for her husband to pick her up. The coworker later tells authorities that while they were talking, an older model blue car with rust damage pulled up beside Sue. She leaned down and spoke with the driver for a moment. The coworker then said that Sue flashed a look, which she interpreted as disgust or annoyance, before she walked around the car, got in the passenger side, and the car drove out of the parking lot. That's about all anybody seems to know. While investigators showed early on that the case wasn't handled properly, they were already beginning from a bad position. They had no witnesses who actually saw a crime take place. The coworker told police that Sue had not been forced into the car nor threatened from what she could tell. So what they have is a woman who willingly got into a car and never came home. Now, I think we all know the idea that she ran away is ridiculous. You don't even have to go through all of the details about leaving behind her purse, money, and ID. All you really need to know is this was a woman who was desperate to get her son back, was taking steps to build a new life, and was extremely excited about the prospect of finally having a custody hearing. It would be easier to list all of the reasons why she wouldn't run away than it would be to even consider the reasons why she might have chosen to, since 40 years later, no one's been able to come up with a reason that makes any sense. Now, operating from the position that Sue's disappearance was connected to foul play rather than her randomly choosing to run away after a work shift without her own car, most people's suspicions turned to the only person in her life she seemed to have any conflicts with, her estranged husband, Alan Cappel. Viewing the case, you can certainly logic your way to this conclusion. They hadn't been getting along, they're separated, he files for divorce and custody, she counterfiles. Let's face it, spouses have killed one another for far less than this. I suppose the issue a lot of people run into is that it wasn't something that caught Alan by surprise or should have shocked him. Sue didn't leave him, take their son, and file for divorce. She went to her parents and took her son with her. Alan, after obtaining their son from a babysitter, files for divorce and custody himself. So he initiates all of this. Now, maybe you could argue that he got angry when she counterfiled, or it was all a power play to try and make her come home, and when that didn't work, he lashed out. I don't think anyone would have a problem believing that. The problem comes in when there's no solid evidence to connect Alan to Sue's disappearance. No witnesses that see him in that blue car, no one who comes forward to say he told them details about it or made threats of doing it. However, there is something very important to consider here. We, the public, do not know all of the details investigators managed to uncover. As discussed earlier, this case was brought before a grand jury in the months after Sue's disappearance. The jury made the decision not to indict, but since grand jury testimony is confidential, we don't exactly know what evidence was presented, what argument the prosecutors made, what their theory was, and what witnesses were actually called in to testify. According to a letter to the editor written by Judy Wolff in the late 1990s, Alan was one of the people called to testify, but he never did. While it's difficult to read entirely between the lines, it's heavily implied that it had something to do with his lawyer not being present. Either way, Judy states that Alan never had to testify before the grand jury, and if that's true, you've really got to wonder what the hell was going on there. People who have looked at the case over the years and have been given access to the files, such as Martin Yant and Tom Lewes Sr., have both made comments about how poorly the case was handled. Lewes went so far as to say that it looked like all actionable leads stopped being worked on 6 to 7 days after Sue was reported missing. If that's true, the primary reason this case remains unsolved is because of a lack of action in those early days. Remember, there was a theory that Patrick Parrish, who drove a car similar to the blue one seen by the witness, may have either loaned his car to Alan or could have been directly involved in Sue's disappearance. He and his cousin, along with another friend, died in a one-car accident 2 weeks after Sue's disappearance. From everything I've read, investigators never got to question them, never got to examine the vehicle before it was totaled, and since the grand jury happened months later, obviously neither man could be called to testify. Also, just an aside to fill in some additional details, reports of the time state that the vehicle was being driven at a high rate of speed when it hit a culvert, flipping the vehicle onto an embankment and killing all 3 occupants. I'm telling you this because I saw a ton of posts online about how they were murdered and their brake lines had been cut, but reports about the accident state information quite to the contrary. Now, a lot of folks started writing letters discussing how neither of the Parrish cousins would have ever been involved in something like this, and they were very offended that their names were brought up. Their feelings are understandable. No one wants to see their loved ones maligned after their deaths when they have no way to defend themselves. I, for one, have seen no evidence to directly connect either man to Sue's disappearance, but I've also never seen what evidence was presented to that grand jury. I think it's also worth noting that investigators, even in 1982, made statements about the fact that Patrick Parrish owned a blue Plymouth Satellite that looked similar to the car seen by the witness. Unfortunately, she was never able to positively identify any car, and even after hypnosis, could not recall additional details about the car or driver. This is why it's so frustrating that apparently the police were not keeping track of all of the license plate numbers of blue cars that were being reported by the Wolff family and the local community. Who knows how many of those blue cars, if looked at closer, the witness might have acknowledged or at least been able to say it's not the same car, but it was the same model or the same year or the same brand. Suffice it to say, with no eyewitnesses who had seen the driver, the car became an incredibly important point of the investigation. Who knows what evidence might have been in the vehicle, nor what the owner might have been willing to say had police gone looking, found a car that matched, and knocked on his door wanting to search that car. Unfortunately, none of that ever happened. So, turning back to Alan, I can absolutely understand why he's the focal point for the Wolff family and why allegedly police files show he was the primary person of interest as well. He's got a direct connection to the victim. They were in the middle of a messy divorce. She's going to contest the child custody. I imagine there's going to be a financial angle to it since he was working for the state and she was working 2 part-time jobs. So, is that what it all really came down to? Money? Control? It's hard to say, but those are some of the oldest motives in the world. The problem is, without actual solid verifiable evidence, all you have is a theory, and that's not enough to make an arrest. Previously, I mentioned how investigator Luz made mention of people who had stated they had been offered money to either kill or abduct Sue in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Man, sure would be nice to know any of those names or who they claimed offered them money, right? Was that part of the grand jury proceeding, or just another piece of vital evidence left in a desk drawer instead of being actively pursued? Yet another frustrating and unanswered question in this case. I think in the end, this case is an example of Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. The witness doesn't see the license plate or the driver. The police don't conduct a thorough enough investigation. 2 people alleged to have maybe have had information or being involved die in an accident 2 weeks later. All you're left with is knowledge of what has happened, what Alan and Sue's relationship was like, and in the absence of anyone else, it seems to fit together. For the purposes of speculation, that works just fine. But when it comes down to warrants, arrests, charges, and trials, even if you somehow did make an arrest, the judge would have laughed this case out of court due to a lack of evidence, unless there is much more evidence than we have been told, which would seem contrary to the grand jury proceedings. There is something I completely agree with law enforcement on when it comes to this case, though. Alan is gone, as are the parish cousins, but there are still people out there who know more than they've shared. There's no way that over 21 years that passed between Sue's disappearance and Alan's death, that, were he involved, something wouldn't have slipped out. I'd imagine that in those weeks immediately following her disappearance, several people may have been talking about what happened or merely what they suspected happened. You've seen it a million times before. Those first few days of the investigation are of the utmost importance, and if they were not handled properly, the result of a case remaining unsolved for more than 40 years is no major surprise. Frustrating, heartbreaking, rage-inducing, but certainly not surprising. There's really never been any other theories presented. Could this have been some kind of a stranger abduction? Maybe, but that doesn't explain why Sue would have willingly gotten into that car. We know she wasn't forced at knife or gunpoint. We know she didn't scream for help or try to get away. All this really tells us is that whoever was driving that car, Sue may not have liked them, Sue may not have wanted to speak with them, but she doesn't appear to have believed that she would be in danger of physical harm by getting into their car. If indeed she made a look of disgust or annoyance, then it has to be someone she knew, and I'd wager someone she didn't think very highly of. What might someone you severely dislike have to say to get you to climb into their car with them? I can't think of a single thing, which only makes the mystery that much deeper. Why did Sue get into that car? Unfortunately, 41 years later, that question is one of hundreds which has never been answered. For 41 years, the Wolff family have wondered what became of their beloved daughter, sister, aunt, and mother. It seems, despite multiple investigations from different cold case units, independent organizations, and private investigators, the truth remains somewhat beneath the surface, just out of reach. On a personal note, I'll be turning 41 this year, which means that Sue went missing a few months before I was born, and I've now lived more than twice as long as she was known to have been alive. I can't begin to imagine what this has been like for her parents, who've dedicated the last 40 years of their lives to trying to do anything they can to find her, while also helping others along the way. It's remarkably admirable to see how some people are capable of transforming a horrible tragedy into something that might be able to help others. But now, Jim and Judy Wolff need your help. We all know someone out there, and likely more than one person, knows what happened that Tuesday night in March of 1982. Visit a Crime Stoppers website and submit a tip anonymously. Send a letter with no return address. Make a call and tell what you know, and don't give your name or contact information. No one cares where the information comes from, just that it's accurate. Give this family a chance to bring Sue home, to lay her to rest, and allow them to grieve, something which can never be fully achieved without confirmation or closure. It isn't a whole lot to ask, to send a message or make a call, but it sure would change their lives forever. Unfortunately, unless someone does come forward, new evidence is found, or Sue herself is located, the disappearance of Susan Wolff Cappel will remain open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information, there are many forums and sites discussing Sue's case. Newspaper Archives offered a wealth of information for this episode, with the Coshocton Tribune and Dover New Philadelphia Times reporter providing the vast majority of details. Sue is listed in NamUs as MP7928. 24 comparisons have been attempted thus far with Jane Doe's, however, there has been no match. If you have any information about the disappearance of Susan Wolff Cappel, please contact the Tuscarawas County Sheriff's Office at 330-339-2000. Her case number is 820-6110. You can also contact the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation at 740-845-2000. Her case number is LI 7902651849. Finally, you can submit tips anonymously online at centralohiocrimestoppers.org. Remember, a $20,000 reward for information leading to Sue's whereabouts is still available. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at TraceEvPod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to thank our amazing Patreon producers: Alicia Lorraine, Andrew Guarino, Ann Bertram, Camelia Tyler, Christine Greco, Danny Renee, Daerthy, Denise Dingsdale, Diane Dyson, Eloanne Meyer, Fabulous TT, Guillermo Pinto, Jennifer Winkler, Julie A. Mangano, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, K.Y., Lars Jensen Fangel, Leslie B., Madison Lahoulier, Marla Wright, Melissa Breckeisen, Nick Mohar Shores, Sarah Lyons, Travis Skepko, Stacy Finnegan, Stephanie Joyner, Stephanie Eve, Tiffany Nelson, and Tom Radford. Without your amazing support, this show would not be possible. So thank you all so much for contributing to Trace Evidence. One quick reminder, if you're planning on attending CrimeCon this year in Orlando, Florida, use promo code TRACE at crimecon.com to save 10% off your pass. Once again, that's promo code TRACE at crimecon.com. If you're interested in learning more about this case or other cases featured on the show, please visit trace-evidence.com. There you can find case breakdowns, all social media links, merchandise shops, case descriptions, media, and options for donating, including PayPal and Patreon, should you wish to support the show. This concludes our look into the frustrating and heartbreaking disappearance of 19-year-old Susan Wolff Cappel. I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll join me next week for another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.